There's a war happening right now. You can't see the tanks. There are no missiles lighting up the night sky, no soldiers storming beaches. But make no mistake, this is warfare, and it's reshaping the global order just as dramatically as any military conflict in history. Welcome to the age of the trade war. The era where economic sanctions are the new missiles, tariffs are the new tanks, and supply chains are the new battlefields. In 2026, as geopolitical tensions reach heights not seen since the Cold War, nations have discovered something remarkable. You don't need to fire a single bullet to bring an adversary to its knees. You just need to control what they can buy, sell, and trade. Right now, the United States has imposed tariffs on Chinese goods that have reached over 100%. China has retaliated with 84% tariffs on American imports. Europe is caught in the crossfire, watching its growth forecasts shrink. Supply chains that took decades to build are being rerouted overnight, and ordinary citizens around the world are paying the price in the form of higher costs, economic uncertainty, and jobs disappearing not to bombs, but to spreadsheets and trade agreements. This isn't just about economics, it's about power. It's about who controls the resources, the technology, and the future. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Trade wars might actually be replacing real wars because they achieve the same strategic goals with far less blood and far more precision. Today, I'm breaking down exactly how economic warfare has become the weapon of choice for superpowers, why it's more effective than traditional military conflict, what it means for your wallet and your future, and whether this new form of warfare is actually better or just differently catastrophic. Let's dive in. Point 1. The weaponization of economics. How money became the new missile. Let's start with the fundamental shift. How did we get to a point where tariffs and sanctions became more powerful than aircraft carriers? The answer lies in globalization itself. For the past 40 years, we built a world economy so interconnected that every nation became dependent on every other nation. Your iPhone? Designed in California, assembled in China, with components from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Your coffee? Beans from Colombia, roasted in Italy, sold at a chain owned by American shareholders. Even weapons systems rely on global supply chains. This interdependence created the ultimate vulnerability. And smart geopolitical players realized, if you can control access to critical goods, resources, or markets, you can cripple an adversary without firing a shot. Look at what's happening in 2026. The US-China trade war has escalated to tariff levels that seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. The United States has imposed tariffs exceeding 100% on Chinese goods, meaning if a product costs $100 in China, it now costs over $200 in America after tariffs. China responded with 84% tariffs on US imports. This isn't negotiation, this is economic warfare. BBC. But here's what makes this so powerful. Unlike a bomb, a tariff is surgical. You can target specific industries, semiconductors, rare earth minerals, electric vehicles, and strangle your opponent's strategic sectors without touching civilian populations directly. You can weaponize trade deals, currency controls, and access to your consumer market. And you can do it all while maintaining plausible deniability as just business. Consider rare earth minerals. China controls about 70% of global production. These materials are essential for everything from smartphones to fighter jets. In 2025, when tensions flared over Taiwan, China didn't need to threaten military action. They simply announced export controls on rare earths. The message was clear. We control what you need, and we can turn off the tap whenever we want. This is the new battlefield. Not Normandy, not the Mekong Delta, but shipping containers, payment systems, and resource choke points. The weapon isn't a rifle, it's a spreadsheet, and the casualties aren't counted in body bags, but in GDP points, unemployment rates, and inflation. The weaponization of economics means that warfare has gone white-collar. And the scary part? It might be even more effective than the old-fashioned kind. Point 2. Why trade wars are replacing real wars, the cold calculation. So why are nations choosing economic warfare over traditional military conflict? The answer is brutally pragmatic. It's cheaper, it's safer, and it works. Let's break down the math. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost the United States over $6 trillion and thousands of American lives over 2 decades. The outcome? Debatable at best. Now compare that to the trade war with China. Yes, American consumers are paying an estimated $1,200 more per household in 2025 due to tariffs. But that's a one-time annual cost spread across the entire population. No military funerals, no decades of occupation, no multi-trillion-dollar rebuilding efforts. Tax foundation. From a strategic perspective, trade wars offer precision that bombs never could. Want to hurt China's electric vehicle industry? Slap a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. Want to pressure Russia? Cut them off from SWIFT, the international banking system. Want to weaken Iran? Sanction their oil exports. Each action targets specific economic sectors while leaving others untouched. This precision matters because modern geopolitics isn't about conquering territory anymore. It's about controlling technology, resources, and economic power. You don't need to invade Taiwan to hurt China. You just need to cut off their access to advanced semiconductor technology. You don't need to bomb Tehran. You just need to prevent them from selling oil. There's also the domestic political calculation. Wars are unpopular. They require asking citizens to send their children to die in foreign lands. They create visible casualties that dominate news cycles and destroy political careers. But trade wars? They're abstract. Most people don't understand tariffs. They notice prices going up at Walmart, but they don't connect it to foreign policy. Politicians can wage economic warfare without the political backlash of military conflict. And here's the kicker. Economic warfare actually achieves many of the same strategic goals as traditional war. It weakens adversaries economically, which limits their military capabilities. It forces them to redirect resources away from threatening activities. It demonstrates power and resolve to allies and enemies alike. And it can lead to regime change just as effectively as invasion. When an economy collapses, governments fall. Look at the Russian sanctions following their actions in Ukraine. The West didn't invade Russia. They didn't need to. They froze assets, banned technology exports, and cut off banking access. The ruble crashed, Russian GDP contracted. Their ability to wage war was significantly diminished, not by missiles, but by spreadsheets. Trade wars are replacing real wars because they offer a high return on investment with minimal risk. They're warfare for the 21st century, efficient, deniable, and devastatingly effective. Point 3. The collateral damage. Who really pays the price? But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Just because trade wars don't kill people directly doesn't mean they're bloodless. Let's talk about who actually suffers when economic warfare becomes the norm. Spoiler alert, it's not the politicians or the billionaires making these decisions, it's you. It's ordinary people caught in the crossfire of economic conflict. In 2026, American consumers are paying the price for tariffs that were supposed to punish China. That $1,200 average increase per household? That's real money coming out of real paycheck. When the US slaps a 100% tariff on Chinese goods, American importers pay that tax. And who do they pass it on to? You at the checkout counter. Meanwhile, American farmers are losing access to the Chinese market because China retaliated with their own tariffs. Soybean farmers in Iowa, who used to export to China, now can't compete. Manufacturing workers in Ohio find themselves laid off as supply chains shift and costs skyrocket. Small businesses that relied on affordable imports suddenly face inventory costs that destroy their margins. And it's not just Americans. This is a global phenomenon. When the US and China engage in a trade war, it disrupts supply chains worldwide. European companies caught in the middle lose business. Developing nations that relied on stable trade relationships find themselves economic refugees in a war they didn't start. UN Sustainable Development. The UN has warned that trade tensions are dragging down global economic growth. The European Union's growth forecast for 2026 has been revised down to 1.3%, partly because of higher US tariffs. Jobs are being lost. Innovation is being stifled. Economic development in poorer nations is being choked off. There's also the human cost that doesn't show up in GDP statistics. When sanctions cripple Iran's economy, ordinary Iranians can't access medicine or food. When tariffs make goods unaffordable, families go without. When trade wars destroy industries, entire communities collapse. Not from bombs, but from economic strangulation. And here's the really insidious part. Unlike traditional war, where at least there's some sense that sacrifices serve a clear purpose, trade wars often hurt everyone involved. Studies show that tariffs reduce economic growth in both countries. It's mutually assured economic destruction. The US hurts China, but it also hurts itself. China retaliates, but damages its own economy further. Everyone loses, except perhaps a few protected industries that benefit from reduced competition. The collateral damage of trade wars is widespread, diffuse, and often invisible. There are no viral videos of destroyed cities, so it doesn't generate outrage. But the suffering is real. It's just hidden in unemployment statistics, inflation rates, and families struggling to make ends meet. Point 4. The new choke points: semiconductors, rare earths, and digital dominance. If trade wars are the new battlefield, then certain resources and industries have become the strategic high ground. Control these, and you control the future. Lose them, and you're at the mercy of your adversaries. Let's talk about the 3 critical choke points in modern economic warfare: semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and digital infrastructure. Semiconductors are the lifeblood of the modern economy. Everything from smartphones to military systems depends on advanced chips. And here's the vulnerability. The vast majority of cutting-edge semiconductors are made by a single company, TSMC, in Taiwan. This creates an existential choke point. If China takes Taiwan, they control the world's semiconductor supply. If the US wants to hurt China, they cut off access to advanced chip technology. That's exactly what's happening. The US has banned exports of advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment to China. This isn't just about economics, it's about preventing China from developing artificial intelligence, advanced weapons, and technological capabilities that could challenge American dominance. China knows this, which is why Taiwan has become such a flashpoint. The island isn't just territory, it's the most valuable piece of economic real estate on Earth. Rare earth minerals are the second choke point. These materials, with names like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, are essential for everything from electric vehicle batteries to wind turbines to military hardware. And China controls about 70% of global production and 90% of processing capacity. This gives China enormous leverage. When trade tensions escalate, China doesn't need to threaten military action. They simply restrict rare earth exports, and suddenly the entire global green energy transition grinds to a halt. The US and Europe scramble to develop alternative sources, but that takes years. Meanwhile, China sits on the resource choke point, like a dragon guarding its hoard. Digital infrastructure is the third battleground. Who controls the internet? Who owns the data? Who builds the 5G networks? These aren't just technical questions, they're geopolitical power struggles. When the US banned Huawei from building 5G infrastructure in allied countries, it wasn't about security concerns alone. It was about preventing China from controlling the digital nervous system of the Western world. Similarly, when Russia was cut off from SWIFT, the international banking messaging system, it demonstrated that control over financial infrastructure is a weapon. You don't need to invade a country to cripple its economy. You just need to flip a switch and lock them out of the global financial system. These choke points represent the strategic terrain of the 21st century. Nations are racing to secure access to these resources and technologies, not because they want to build better phones, but because whoever controls the choke points controls the future. This is the new arms race, and the weapons are supply chains, technological standards, and resource monopolies. Point 5. Is this better or just differently terrible? The future of conflict. So here's the uncomfortable question we need to ask. Is economic warfare actually better than traditional military conflict, or have we just traded one form of suffering for another? On one hand, the case for trade wars being better is straightforward. Fewer people die, cities aren't reduced to rubble, there's no refugee crisis of millions fleeing bombs and bullets. From a purely humanitarian calculus, economic coercion seems preferable to military invasion. There's also the argument that economic interdependence, even weaponized, actually prevents hot wars. If the US and China went to war militarily, it would be catastrophic. Nuclear powers clashing could end civilization. But a trade war, as painful as it is, doesn't pose an existential threat to humanity. Maybe the weaponization of economics is actually the safety valve that prevents World War III. But here's the darker perspective. Economic warfare might be creating a different kind of hell, one that's more insidious precisely because it's less visible. Traditional wars have endings. They result in treaties, reconciliations, and eventually peace. Trade wars can drag on indefinitely, creating permanent states of economic hostility. We're entering a world where economic blocs are hardening, supply chains are fracturing along ideological lines, and the global cooperation that lifted billions out of poverty is being dismantled. There's also the destabilizing effect. When economies are strangled, people suffer in ways that create political instability. Collapsing economies lead to failed states, which breed extremism, terrorism, and eventually, real wars. Economic warfare might not kill people directly, but it creates the conditions for violence down the road. And let's not forget, we might be sleepwalking into an era where economic and military warfare combine. China's military buildup isn't happening in isolation from trade tensions. Russia's aggression isn't separate from economic sanctions. We may be creating a world where economic warfare is just the opening act, softening targets before traditional military conflict. The question of whether this is better depends on your time frame. In the short term, yes. Fewer people are dying than would in a hot war between superpowers. But in the long term, we might be building a more fragmented, hostile, and unstable world that eventually erupts into conflicts that make trade wars look like the peaceful option. So let me bring this home. Trade wars aren't just economic policy. They're the new form of warfare for the 21st century. They're how nations project power, punish adversaries, and compete for dominance without the immediate bloodshed of traditional conflict. In 2026, we're living through a transformation in how power operates. Tariffs that exceed 100%, sanctions that cripple entire economies, technology bans that reshape industries, rare earth export controls that hold entire supply chains hostage. This is the economic battlefield, and it's every bit as consequential as any military campaign in history. The weapons have changed, but the game is the same. Control resources, dominate strategic sectors, and force adversaries to bend to your will. The difference is that now, the casualties are measured in GDP points and unemployment rates instead of body counts. The destruction happens in factory closures and supply chain disruptions instead of bombed-out cities. But don't mistake the lack of visible violence for peace. This is still war. It still creates suffering. It still damages millions of lives. It's just quieter, more abstract, easier to ignore until you realize your job disappeared, your costs doubled, and the economic future you were promised has been sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical competition. As we move deeper into 2026 and beyond, the trade war between the US and China will intensify. Other nations will pick sides, supply chains will continue fracturing. The global economy will splinter into competing blocs, and ordinary people around the world will continue paying the price for decisions made in distant capitals. The question isn't whether trade wars are replacing real wars, they already have. The question is whether this new form of warfare will lead to a more stable world, or whether it's just the prologue to conflicts we can't yet imagine. One thing is certain, the economic battlefield is here to stay. And we're all soldiers now, whether we enlisted or not.